Imagine this. It's a cold January morning in Wichita, Kansas. A family is starting their day. The father, Joseph Otero, kisses his wife goodbye. The children, Joseph Jr. and little Josephine, are getting ready for school. It's an ordinary home in an ordinary neighborhood. But outside, someone is watching. A man, a predator, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He's been studying this family for weeks. He knows their routines. He knows when they leave for work, when they come home, when they sleep. And this morning he decides it's time. That man was Dennis Rader. The world would soon know him by a name he gave himself, BTK Killer, torture. Kill. The first attack Rader broke into the Otero home that morning in 1974. He cut the phone line. He brought with him a kit, ropes, bindings, and weapons. When the family resisted, he overpowered them. What happened inside those walls was unspeakable. By the time he left, 4 members of the Otero family were dead. Joseph, Julie, Joseph Jr., and 11-year-old Josephine. It wasn't a robbery. Nothing of value was taken. This was something else entirely. Wichita police had never seen a crime scene like it. The bindings, the deliberate staging. This was not random violence. This was ritual. And though they didn't know it yet, this was just the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt Wichita for the next 3 decades. The monster speaks. In most cases, killers try to hide. They don't want to get caught. But BTK was different. He wanted credit. He wanted everyone to know it was him. Weeks later, a letter arrived at a local newspaper. In it, the killer described in disturbing detail how he murdered the Oteros. He demanded recognition. He signed it with a chilling phrase, "I am BTK, bind them, torture them, kill them." It was the birth of a name that would terrify Kansas for generations. Wichita in fear. The effect on the city was immediate. People who never locked their doors suddenly bought heavy deadbolts. Parents who once let their kids roam free now kept them inside. Gun sales soared. Hardware stores sold out of locks and chains. Wichita was no longer a sleepy Midwestern town. It was a hunting ground. And everyone knew it. But what they didn't know was even worse. BTK was already stalking his next victims. A stalker in the dark, Dennis Rader wasn't sloppy. He planned his attacks carefully. He called them projects. Each victim was studied in detail. He followed them, watched them, learned their schedules. He even broke into homes weeks before, stealing small items, unlocking windows, moving things around. When the day came, he moved like a ghost. He cut phone lines, he wore gloves, he used bindings from his kit, and then he played out his fantasies. To Rader, it wasn't about robbery or revenge. It was about control. The terror in his victim's eyes gave him what he craved. The pattern emerges. After the Oteros, more killings followed. Young women were targeted in their homes. One woman was strangled in her bed. Another was attacked after Rader waited for her to return home. Each crime was connected by the same signature: binding, torture, killing. And then, almost as if to mock the police, BTK sent another letter. He listed the names of his victims. He described his methods. He wrote, "How many do I have to kill before I get a name in the paper or some national recognition?" This wasn't just about killing. This was about fame. And Wichita realized with horror. They weren't just dealing with a murderer. They were dealing with a man who wanted to become a legend. BTK had struck. He had revealed himself in the most terrifying way possible. But this was only the beginning. Over the next 2 decades, Dennis Rader would stalk, strangle, and taunt an entire city, while living a double life as a husband, a father, a church leader, and a neighbor. The question is, how did he get away with it for so long? And what finally brought him down? Wichita thought the Otero murders might be a tragic one-time event, but BTK wasn't finished, not even close. He wanted the city to know he was still out there. Soon, another letter arrived. This time, he left it in a book at the local library. The letter described the murders in chilling detail, details only the killer could know. And at the end, he demanded something, and recognition. I am not a phantom. I am not imaginary. I am BTK. Bind them, torture them, kill them. Police realized they weren't just dealing with a murderer. They were dealing with a narcissist who wanted the spotlight. He wanted fame. He wanted the world to fear his name, taunting the police. In 1977, another letter came. This time, he bragged about how easy it was to slip in and out of homes. He even compared himself to other famous killers, Jack the Ripper, son of Sam. But he insisted he was smarter, better, a killer who deserved his own place in history. The arrogance was terrifying, and it worked. Wichita was consumed with fear. Every creak in the night, every barking dog, every stranger in the street could be BTK. The murders continue. Between 1974 and 1977, more lives were claimed. A young woman strangled in her apartment. Another found bound in her bedroom. Each time, the method was the same. Bindings, cruel torture, slow death. And every time, BTK escaped without a trace. Police swarmed neighborhoods, set up roadblocks, interviewed hundreds of suspects. But nothing. The killer was always one step ahead, like a ghost. A community in panic. By the late 1970s, Wichita was living in paranoia. Hardware stores couldn't keep deadbolts in stock. Gun sales exploded. Families slept with the lights on. One survivor later said, "It felt like he was everywhere, like he was watching all of us." But the cruelest part? He probably was. Rader admitted years later that he spent hours prowling neighborhoods. He sat in parked cars, pretending to read, while spying on women through their windows. He broke into houses just to move things around, leaving behind the sense that something was wrong, even if nothing was taken. It wasn't just murder. It was psychological warfare. The mind of BTK didn't just want to kill, he wanted to play God. In his writings, he referred to his victims as projects or hits. They weren't people to him. They were objects of his fantasy. He wrote about something he called Factor X, a force that he claimed drove him to kill. But the truth was simpler. He killed because he wanted control, because he enjoyed it, because he craved the feeling of power. And every letter he sent, every taunt to police, was his way of tightening that control over the whole city. The disappearance. By 1979, BTK had killed multiple times and terrorized an entire community. Then suddenly, silence. The letters stopped. The murders stopped. Wichita was left in uneasy peace. Was he dead? Had he been arrested for another crime, or was he simply waiting? For years, there was nothing but silence. But the truth was far more disturbing. Dennis Rader was alive and well. He had simply decided to change tactics. The double life. During his disappearance, Rader built a new identity. He got married, had 2 children, became a Boy Scout leader, worked as a compliance officer, handing out tickets to neighbors for unkempt lawns and broken fences. And most shocking of all, he became president of his church. By day, he was the picture of a responsible, upstanding citizen. By night, he still fantasized about bondage, control, and killing. He kept souvenirs from his crimes, jewelry, photos, even sketches. When his wife and kids weren't home, he acted out his fantasies in secret. For decades, Dennis Rader lived this double life, respected by neighbors, trusted by his community, all while hiding the darkest of secrets. Wichita began to relax. They thought BTK was gone, that he was part of the past. But in 2004, after more than 2 decades of silence, BTK came back, and his arrogance would finally be his undoing. For more than 20 years, BTK had been a ghost. No letters, no murders, nothing. Wichita dared to breathe again. The city began to believe the nightmare was over. but BTK was still there. Dennis Rader was living a quiet life. He had a steady job, a wife, children, a respected role in his church. And yet, the darkness never left him. The fantasies kept him company in secret. The memories of what he had done still thrilled him. And in 2004, his ego couldn't resist anymore. BTK came back. The letters begin again. It started small. A local newspaper published an article about the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders. The story described BTK as a killer lost to history, a ghost who had never been caught. That was all it took. BTK couldn't stand being forgotten. Soon, a padded envelope arrived at a Wichita television station. Inside was a photocopy of his old writings and a chilling message. I am still here. The nightmare had returned. Taunting Wichita again. BTK began sending more packages. He left messages in cereal boxes. He sent photographs, victims' possessions, even a sketch of one of his crimes. The police realized with horror that they were talking to the real BTK. The details were too specific to fake. He mocked them. He dared them to catch him. He wanted everyone to know BTK was back. A dangerous game. The FBI was called in. A task force was reassembled. The city fell into fear once more. Parents warned their children not to go out alone. People jumped at every sound in the night. But BTK wasn't killing anymore. Not yet. This time, his weapon was fear. The letters themselves were enough to send Wichita spiraling back into panic. And he loved it. But BTK made a mistake. He forgot that the world had changed. Technology had advanced, and the tools of 1974 would no longer protect him in 2004. The fatal question. In one of his letters, BTK asked the police a bizarre question. He wrote, "If I send you a floppy disk, will you be able to trace it back to me? Tell me the truth." It was almost laughable, but police saw an opportunity. They responded through a newspaper ad pretending to answer him. The disk will be safe. BTK believed them, and that arrogance sealed his fate. The floppy disk weeks later, a purple floppy disk arrived at a local news station. Investigators rushed it to their forensic lab. It didn't take long. Hidden inside the files was digital metadata, and that metadata contained a name: Christ Lutheran Church, and a user named Dennis. Detectives couldn't believe it. BTK, the faceless terror of Wichita, had just outed himself with a single floppy disk. The net closes, and detectives quietly began watching Dennis Rader. He was a middle-aged man, a compliance officer for the city, a family man, a church president. But they needed more than just a name. They needed DNA. So they followed his daughter. When she went to a college health clinic, they collected a pap smear. The DNA was tested against evidence from BTK's crime scenes. It was a match. Dennis Rader was BTK. The arrest. On February 25th, 2005, police made their move. Rader was pulled over while driving near his home. As officers surrounded him, he looked up and said calmly, "I guess it's me." The hunt was finally over. But what shocked everyone wasn't just his arrest. It was what came next. The confession, the trial, and the horrifying, matter-of-fact way Dennis Rader described his crimes, as if they were nothing more than chores. After his arrest in 2005, Dennis Rader was taken into custody. The entire city of Wichita was stunned. This was BTK, this mild-mannered man with glasses, the church president, the Boy Scout leader, the husband and father. It didn't seem possible, but the evidence was overwhelming, and soon Rader himself began to talk. Cold and calculated. In hours of police interviews, Rader calmly described his crimes. He spoke with no remorse, no shame, no empathy. He recounted the Otero murders as though he were reading a grocery list. He explained how he bound his victims, how he watched them struggle, how he waited for them to die. At times, detectives sat in stunned silence. They had spent decades chasing a phantom. Now here he was, explaining every detail, like a man talking about fixing his car. One officer later said, "It was chilling." He spoke about murder the way you and I talk about mowing the lawn. The double life revealed. As investigators pieced together his life, the truth became even more horrifying. Dennis Rader had lived a perfectly ordinary existence on the surface. He had a wife who knew nothing, 2 children who adored him. He served as president of his church. He enforced local codes as a compliance officer, lecturing neighbors about weeds in their yards while keeping a collection of ropes, masks, and photos of his victims at home. To his family, he was a husband and father. To Wichita, he was a respected citizen. But in secret, he was BTK. The contrast was unbearable. How could someone so normal be capable of such evil? Preparing for trial, Rader was charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder. Prosecutors wanted to make sure every victim's family saw justice. In 2005, Rader appeared in court for the first time. The world watched as the mask came off. Instead of a monster in chains, they saw a small, balding man in glasses. But as soon as he spoke, the monster revealed itself. In open court, Rader gave a step-by-step account of each killing, his voice steady, his words horrifying. He described how he stalked his victims, how he broke into their homes, how he tied them up and strangled them, how he watched them die. The courtroom sat in silence. Families wept. Even hardened reporters admitted they had never heard anything so cold. No remorse. When asked if he felt guilty, Rader gave vague answers. He blamed Factor X, some mysterious force that he claimed drove him to kill. But everyone knew the truth. Dennis Rader killed because he wanted to. Because it gave him power. Because it fed the darkness inside him. One prosecutor said, "He is not possessed by a demon. He is not controlled by a force. He is simply evil." The sentencing. In August 2005, Rader was sentenced. The judge gave him 10 consecutive life sentences, 1 for each of his victims. He will never walk free again. He will die behind bars. As the sentence was read, survivors and family members addressed him directly. Some cried, some shouted, some simply stared at him in silence, refusing to give him the attention he craved. One victim's relative said, "You thought you were smarter than everyone else? But you're just a coward. And now you'll spend the rest of your life locked away like the animal you are." Aftermath. The trial ended, but the scars remained. Wichita struggled to move on. Families tried to heal, but the legacy of BTK could never be erased. The man they once trusted, the neighbor, the church leader, had been living a double life of unimaginable cruelty. And even behind bars, Dennis Rader still enjoyed the attention. He gave interviews, wrote letters, and reveled in the infamy of being BTK. But to the world, he was no longer powerful. He was just an old man in a cell, stripped of control, remembered only for his evil. BTK's story doesn't just end with his arrest. It left behind lessons about trust, about vigilance, about how monsters can hide in plain sight. The final chapter isn't about Dennis Rader at all. It's about the victims and how justice finally caught up with him. When the cell door slammed shut on Dennis Rader, Wichita finally exhaled. The faceless terror that haunted them for more than 30 years had a face. The whispers in the dark had a name. The phantom had been unmasked. But the story of BTK doesn't end with his imprisonment. It lives on in the people he hurt, in the community he scarred, and in the lessons his crimes left behind. Lessons in fear. For decades, BTK showed how fear could paralyze an entire city. Women carried guns in their purses. Parents taught their children never to answer the door. People who once waved to strangers began to suspect everyone. Fear spread like wildfire. And that was exactly what BTK wanted. Killing wasn't enough. He wanted control. not just over his victims, but over all of Wichita. And for a time, he had it, like the mask of normalcy. Perhaps the most disturbing part of the BTK case is not what Dennis Rader did in the shadows, but what he did in the daylight. He was a husband, a father, a church president, a Boy Scout leader, a man who lectured his neighbors about keeping their lawns tidy, all while secretly binding, torturing, and killing innocent people. It proves something chilling. Evil does not always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like the man next door. The victim's strength. But BTK's story isn't just about him. It's about the people who survived him, the families who endured decades of unanswered questions, the survivors who faced him in court and spoke the truth he couldn't silence. One victim's daughter said, "You tried to destroy us, but we are still here. Stronger than you, stronger than your name." In the end, it was their voices that truly defeated him. A community healed. Wichita will never forget BTK. The city still bears the scars. But with his capture and sentencing, the healing began. People who once lived in fear began to step outside again. Neighbors who once suspected each other learned to trust again. And families who lost loved ones finally found some measure of peace. Justice had taken 30 years, but it had come. The monster in a cell. Today, Dennis Rader sits in prison, serving 10 consecutive life sentences. The man who once believed he was untouchable is now just another inmate. He will die behind bars, remembered not for the life he built in public, but for the horror he inflicted in secret. He wanted to be famous, and in a way, he is, but not as the criminal mastermind he imagined. Instead, he is remembered as the coward who called himself BTK, a pathetic man who lived a lie and was brought down by his own arrogance. Final reflection. The story of BTK is more than true crime. It's a warning, a reminder that monsters can wear masks, that they can live among us, hiding in plain sight. But it's also a reminder of something stronger, that justice, though slow, can prevail, that victims' voices are more powerful than any killer's lies, and that in the end, evil never wins. Dennis Rader will spend the rest of his life in a prison cell, but his victims live on. Their strength, their resilience, their courage, those are the legacies that matter. BTK may have bound, tortured, and killed, but he could not destroy. He could not erase, and he could not escape the truth. This was the story of Dennis Rader, the BTK Killer, a man who terrorized a city, lived a double life, and was finally brought to justice by his own arrogance. He thought he was untouchable. He thought he was smarter than everyone else. But in the end, he was caught. And the world will remember him not as a genius, not as a legend, but as a coward, a predator, and a prisoner.